been accused of something that is just ridiculous? Like maybe someone at your house is going on a witch hunt, trying to figure out who ate the last granola bar. And you're like, who cares? Or maybe it's ridiculous because of who is accusing you. Maybe someone comes up to you and goes, hey, you haven't been to the gym in a while. And you know full well they haven't been to the gym in months. Well, this type of scenario, this accusation that is just ridiculous, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. See, last week, we were introduced to this guy named Stephen. And Stephen, he was an early church leader. And he got in trouble with the religious establishment because he was performing signs and wonders in the name of Jesus. And so he actually gets arrested and put on trial. And today, we're going to look at his response to being put on trial. So we're going to be in Acts chapter 7. It's going to be up here on the screens if you need it. Acts chapter 7, starting in verse 1. It says this, it says, then the high priest asked Stephen, are these accusations true? So basically the judge is coming and going, hey, a lot of accusations have been thrown out. Are they true? This was Stephen's reply. Brothers and fathers, listen to me. Our glorious God appeared to our ancestor Abraham in Mesopotamia before he settled in Haran. God told him, leave your native land and your relatives and come into the land that I will show you. So Stephen's response, when the judge asked him, are these accusations true, is to tell a story. And he tells a story that everybody in the room would be familiar with because it's an origin story. It's the story of how God chose the nation of Israel, which every person in that room was. They were all Israelites. How God had chosen them to be his instruments to reach the world. And so Stephen starts out by saying, don't you remember? God came to Abraham and he said, Abraham, leave your people, leave your relatives, the land that you know, and go to a land that I'll show you. God didn't tell him what land that would be, where that land was. He didn't tell him the next step. He just said simply, go. And that's what Abraham did. And so there's a lot more that Stephen begins to say in verse 4 through 43. There's a lot more of the story, but it's going to be easier for us if I just paraphrase it. I would encourage you to go back later and read it for yourself. It's Acts chapter 7, verse 4 through 43. But here is what it says in my own words, okay? This is the Tyler version of Acts 4 through 43. So we're told about Abraham and how he needs to go. Well then, next, Stephen brings up this other guy. It's actually Abraham's great-great-grandchild, Joseph. And Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. And he is in Egypt as a slave in a dungeon. And it's from there that God begins to elevate him. He actually becomes the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, only below the king, which is called Pharaoh. And then a great famine comes. And it affects Egypt and all the surrounding nations, including Israel, including Joseph's brothers. And because God is with him, God uses Joseph to save Egypt and all the surrounding nations from a huge famine. And then Stephen goes, but even more than that, a few generations later, the Egyptians no longer liked the Israelites, and actually they made them slaves. And we're introduced to another guy, a guy named Moses. See, Moses was born into slavery. He was an Israelite born into slavery, but even worse than that, he was born at a time of genocide, a time when they were killing all of the Israelite baby boys. And yet God miraculously saves him. But even more than that, not only does God save him, but in an ironic twist, Moses is actually raised by Pharaoh's household, by the very person who had given the order to kill him. He's raised as an Egyptian. But as Moses grows up and he becomes a young man, he makes a huge mistake and he kills an Egyptian. and he has to flee. He has to run to the desert to save his life. And he lives in the desert for several years. And yet one day God comes to Moses as an old man. He says, Moses, I'm going to use you to save my people from slavery. And that's exactly what he does. Through Moses, God performs many signs and wonders. In fact, at one point, he even parts a sea, and the Israelites walk through it. And then when the Egyptians who are chasing them come, God no longer parts it, and it wipes out the whole Egyptian army. And it saves all the Israelites' people from slavery without anybody getting hurt from Israel. And that's an amazing story. And you would think at this point, you're like, man, I bet the Israelites, they have total confidence in God, right? I bet they follow him and they'll do whatever he asks, because that's amazing. But that's not what happened. Stephen ends by saying, even after all this happens, those very same people, a few weeks later, because they no longer saw God right next to them, they made idols to worship. And Stephen uses this as his reply while he's on trial. He's trying to show how we are just like the Israelites. And in this passage, there's a few things that seem to stand out to me. Here's the first thing. See, God asks us to follow him and be obedient even when we don't understand why or where we're going. I mean, remember verse 3 that we read. It says this in verse 3. It says, God told him, leave your native land and your relatives and come into the land that I will show you. Right? God didn't tell him where the land was. He didn't give him a 4-step plan of how he was going to do this. He didn't even show him where it would be or how long it would take. He just said, go. And that's what Abraham was called to do. See, we don't have to know the final place that God is calling us to be obedient. Instead, we simply go to the place that he told us to go. And we wait for him to tell us where to go next. Our job isn't to know the final destination. Our job is to follow God. Second thing that stood out to me is this. We're a mess. I'm a mess. You're a mess. The Israelites were a mess. I mean, my goodness. They were saved from a famine. They were saved from slavery. And a few weeks later, they're worshiping an idol. Are you kidding me? But I don't think we're all that different from the Israelites. I mean, think about it. Whatever faith we have begins to go away when tough times come. Whatever voice of God that we feel like we've heard, it begins to be muted if we come on hard times. Whatever will we have to follow God, it seems to melt away if we have any kind of failure. It just seems to go away. See, we're a mess. And we need God. So if that's the case, if we're a mess and we need God, what should we do about it? Here's what I think we should do, at least to start. I want to challenge you to ask God each day this week to show you where he wants you to go, and then do it. Ask God, where do you want me to go? Get out of bed every morning and ask him. And then simply do it. Don't ask him the 10-step plan. Don't ask why. Don't ask where. Just ask, where do you want me to go? What do you want me to do? And do it. And then I want to challenge you to do a second thing. I want to challenge you to share it. Share with a friend or family member this week one of the things God spoke to you and how you did it. Share about one of the ways that you heard God speak and how you actually did it. Because I'm convinced of this. We are all a mess without God. And we don't need to be the ones leading our lives. We need God to lead for us. We just simply need to follow.